Our story begins not with a bang, but with a whisper in the heart of Toronto's bustling financial district. Nestled among the glass and steel towers at 4100 Yonge Street stood the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce, a fortress of finance that projected an image of unshakable security. It was a place where money moved in armored trucks and rested behind steel doors, a rhythm of commerce as predictable as the sunrise. But in the early hours of September 4th, 1993, that rhythm was shattered. The bank's massive, multi-ton vault, a behemoth designed to withstand explosives and torches, had been breached. Not through force, but through finesse. The thieves hadn't blown the door, they had, it seemed, convinced it to open. And when the sun rose, $10.5 million in cash and negotiable securities had simply ceased to exist. It was one of the largest cash robberies in Canadian history, a ghost crime with no suspects, no forced entry, and no witnesses. Just an empty vault and a silent, mocking mystery. The investigation fell upon the shoulders of the Metro Toronto Police, and all eyes quickly turned to the one man whose presence was required for the vault. Sanctity, the manager. Leonard James DeMambro was a man who embodied trust. In his late 40s, with a receding hairline and the weary, dependable eyes of a lifelong banker, Len was a pillar of his workplace. He was a family man, known for his calm demeanor and meticulous nature. Colleagues described him as quiet, perhaps a little reserved, but fiercely dedicated. He was the last one to lock up, the first one to arrive. He knew the vault's complex dual combination lock, the alarm codes, the intricate dance of security protocols, as well as he knew his own name. In the days following the heist, he presented a picture of shell-shocked confusion, cooperating fully with police, his face a mask of bewildered betrayal. He was, by all initial accounts, the perfect victim, a loyal employee whose fortress had been violated. But as detectives peeled back the layers of the perfect crime, tiny cracks began to appear in Len DeMambro's composed facade. The vault's door showed no signs of tampering. The alarm logs were clean. It was as if the thieves had floated through the walls. The only logical conclusion was an inside job, and the only insider with the knowledge and access was Len. The investigation, led by seasoned detectives who had seen every manner of deception, began to circle him. They discovered financial pressures he had kept hidden, whispers of debts and strains that didn't yet fit the image of the prudent banker. Yet, there was no direct evidence. No witness placed him at the scene that night. No forensic clue tied him to the missing millions. He was their man, but the case was built on circumstantial sand. Without a confession or a witness, the mountain of reasonable doubt was simply too high to climb. The case grew cold, the file thickening with frustration, a monument to a crime that had been executed with chilling perfection. For nearly 2 years, the Toronto bank robbery faded from the headlines, relegated to the realm of unsolved legends. Len DeMambro, though living under a cloud of suspicion, remained a free man, continuing his life in the suburbs of Toronto. The millions were gone, likely scattered and laundered beyond recovery. It was a closed case in everything but name. But then, a phone call from another continent shattered the silence. It was an investigator from the Royal Hong Kong Police. They had a Canadian in custody, a man caught in a separate fraud scheme. And this man, desperate to cut a deal, was offering up a story so incredible, so audacious that it seemed ripped from a Hollywood thriller. His name was Stephen David Reed. Reed was not your typical snitch. He was a ghost from Canada's criminal past, a man already infamous. In the 1970s, he was part of the notorious Stopwatch Gang, so named for their precision and efficiency during a string of over 100 bank and armored car robberies across North America. Reed was the mastermind, the cool-headed planner who once used a stopwatch to time his heists. He was a folk hero of sorts in the underworld, a man who had escaped from high-security prisons and lived a life of romanticized banditry. By the early 90s, however, that life had caught up with him. He was battling a fierce heroin addiction, His legendary luck was running out, and he was facing serious time. Sitting in a Hong Kong jail cell, he saw a way out. He would trade the biggest secret of his career for his freedom. He confessed to being one of the architects of the Toronto CIBC heist, and then he gave them the name of his inside man, Leonard DeMambro. The revelation was a seismic shock to the dormant investigation. Stephen Reed's confession was not just an admission, it was a blueprint. He described a plot born not in a shadowy backroom, but in the bright light of a public library. He explained how he and his partner, a man named Patrick Michael Mitchell, had spent months casing the bank. They learned Len's routines, his habits, the make and model of his car. And then they approached him, not with threats but with an offer. Reed, with his quiet, almost intellectual charm, laid out the plan. They wouldn't need guns. They wouldn't need violence. All they needed was Len. They would exploit a tiny, almost poetic flaw in the bank's security, the fact that the manager, a human being, was the one who carried the combinations in his head. They would follow him home one evening, and there, in the privacy of his own garage, they would use the one tool he couldn't defend against: fear for his family. The picture Reed painted was cinematic and terrifying. He described how he and Mitchell, on the night of September 3rd, had waited in the shadows near DeMambro's home. As Len pulled into his driveway, they moved. They cornered him in his garage. There were no weapons shown, but the threat was palpable, hanging in the air like a physical force. "We know your family is inside," one of them said, their voices calm and lethal. The demand was simple. Go back to the bank, disable the alarms, and open the vault. Do it, and your wife and children will never know we were here. Refuse, and the unspoken consequences would unfold. It was a choice between betraying his employer and protecting his family. Under that crushing duress, Len DeMambro, the dependable banker, made his choice. He drove back to the CIBC with Reed and Mitchell hidden in the back seat of his own car, and he let the ghosts in. With this new testimony, the pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with devastating force. Leonard DeMambro was no longer a suspect. He was a victim who had become an accomplice under the most extreme coercion. The police moved quickly, arresting Reed, Mitchell, and, finally, DeMambro himself. The public's perception of the quiet banker flipped overnight. He was no longer a greedy embezzler, he was a tragic figure, a man broken by an impossible decision. The stage was set for a courtroom drama that would captivate the nation, a trial that would put the stopwatch gang legend in the dock alongside the everyman he had ensnared. The trial was a clash of narratives. The prosecution painted Stephen Reed as a master manipulator, a career criminal who had expertly identified and exploited a weakness. They argued that while the initial contact may have involved threats, DeMambro had ample opportunity to call for help during the long, dark hours inside the bank. The defense, however, framed Len as a hostage in his own life, a man whose every action that night was dictated by the terror that a single wrong move would bring violence crashing down upon his home. The tension in the courtroom was a physical thing, a wire stretched taut. And then came the moment that would define the entire case. Stephen Reed took the stand. He was gaunt, his famous charm faded by addiction and incarceration, but his voice was clear and steady. Under cross-examination, he was asked to describe the exact moment in the garage when they threatened DeMambro. Reed paused, his eyes scanning the room before landing for a fleeting second on Len. And then he delivered the line that sucked the air out of the courtroom. "We never actually threatened his family," Reed said, his tone almost matter-of-fact. He claimed the entire scenario was a fiction, a story they had concocted to ensure DeMambro's cooperation. There had been no direct threat, no mention of his wife or children. They had simply implied danger, relying on a father's and husband's own imagination to do the work for them. The coercion, the central pillar of DeMambro's defense, was revealed to be a phantom. It was a psychological masterstroke, and in that moment, Leonard DeMambro was transformed from a coerced victim back into a willing participant. The jury saw a man who, when faced with a test of his character, had chosen the path of least resistance, seduced by the ghost of a threat and the promise of a share in a fortune he was too scared to either fully take or outright refuse. The verdicts came down like gavel blows of fate. Stephen Reed and Patrick Mitchell were convicted and given lengthy sentences, another chapter in their long criminal histories. Leonard DeMambro was also found guilty. The judge, while acknowledging the immense pressure he was under, stated that his duty was to sound the alarm, not to open the vault. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison. The man who had tried to have it both ways, to be both victim and villain, lost everything: his career, his reputation, his freedom. He became a ghost of the financial district, a cautionary tale of how easily a life built on order can be unraveled by chaos. Stephen Reed would eventually be released and attempt to reinvent himself as a writer, his past forever stalking him until his death. The millions were never fully recovered, the paper trail long gone cold. But the legacy of the heist remains, not in the money, but in the chilling precision of its execution and the devastating ambiguity of its human cost. It proves that the most sophisticated security system in the world is no match for the complexities of the human heart, and that the most terrifying threats are sometimes the ones we never even hear. In the end, the vault wasn't cracked by a master safecracker, but by a master of the human psyche. If stories like this keep you hooked, hit subscribe for more.